Well, today we're going to conclude our series, You Might Be a Foolish Woman If, and we are going to talk today about the only kind of fool that you and I should ever want to be. And we're going to talk specifically about two famous fools who were really role models for you and me. They were role models for you and me as we should aspire to be foolish just like they were. The first famous fool that we're going to talk about is one that's probably the most well-known character in the Old Testament. Of course, that was King David. And King David had one of the best days of his life. It's recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 6. It was a day when he and the people of Israel welcomed the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence with them, back into their nation's capital there at Jerusalem. And David and the people, it was a great day of celebration, a great day of worship. And David was in the big middle of all that celebration and worship, leading his people. And it says there in 2 Samuel 6:14, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. I love this, okay? Girls, I was raised Baptist. We didn't dance years ago as Baptists, but I love looking at this and seeing that David was dancing. And he wasn't just dancing, he was dancing with all of his might. That means with all of his heart, his soul, his strength. Listen, he was dancing in worship to God. He was willing to be, in some ways, a fool for God in his worship, because we're going to see that as he was down there dancing and celebrating with all his might before the Lord, there was someone who was looking down on him saying, "What a fool, what a fool." And if you know Scripture, you know who that woman was. That was his wife, Michal. That evening, David came home after worshiping the Lord and after that great day of celebration. It says in 2 Samuel 6, chapter 6, verse 20, that when he returned home to bless his family, listen, he wanted to keep the party and the celebration going, wanted to bless his family. Michal came out to meet him, and she said in disgust, basically, "You fool. What a big fool you made out of yourself. I saw what you were doing down there. What a fool." You know what he said to her? David said to her, "I was dancing before the Lord. I was celebrating before the Lord." And then verse 22 he says, "And I am willing to look even more foolish than this." Listen, when it came to worshiping God, David was willing to be criticized as even a fool, to look foolish before others. And I want to ask you something. In your worship before the Lord, are you willing to worship him the way David did with abandon? As I said, I was raised a good Baptist girl, and we didn't dance much back then. I think a lot of things have changed. We even have a dance group at our church these days, which is a Baptist church. It's a wonderful thing. But I'm from those old days, and old habits die hard, and I'm rather sedate in my own worship. I'm in the choir at our church, and this past Sunday we were singing a great song, just a beautiful song, and I was on the front row where I'm usually not on the choir, and we were singing this great song, and I was singing as much as I could with all of my heart and all of my spirit. It was a great moment. The song, just everything, it was just a beautiful experience, a worship experience for me. And you know what happened at the end of that song? When we finished that song, something happened that so surprised me. At the end of that song, all of a sudden I found myself doing this. I just threw my hands up. And you know what I thought? Whoops. I thought, whoops, that's not what I usually do at the end of a song like that. And for a moment I was a little embarrassed, and for a moment I thought, what are people going to think about me on the front row just going like this at the end of a song? And then I realized, you know what? It wasn't a whoops. It was a worship. Girls, listen, there are times with our worship we need to be willing to even look like a fool, perhaps, and to look foolish before our own eyes and maybe before those who might judge us. Girls, are you willing to worship him and be a fool like David was? In his worship, he was willing even to be criticized and called a fool because he was going to worship with all of his heart. That's the kind of fool you and I need to aspire to be. Our second famous fool is a New Testament character, and his name, of course, is the Apostle Paul. Paul wrote the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians in large part to correct problems in the churches, but he also wrote it to defend his apostleship. You see, when Paul left the city and the church at Corinth, he was criticized, and that criticism got back to him. They were tearing him down. They were saying, he's not that great of a speaker. I mean, who is he after all? Why should we listen to him? And he heard about that criticism, and it must have hurt him. And so part of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he's defending his apostleship to them. And they were looking down on him, and perhaps some were even saying, what a fool he is. I mean, look what he's going through. And Paul says this to them in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 10 to 13. He says, we, and he's talking about he and the precious men, the companions of his that traveled with him. He said, we are fools for Christ's sake. And he said, we were willing to be fools in our service to you, in our service for Christ. Paul didn't care what they called him, how they criticized him, how they tore him down, how they judged him, and how they misunderstood him. He said, we're willing to be fools for Christ to serve him. If you call us a fool, that's just fine. But Paul was not only willing to be a fool for Christ's sake in his service, he was also willing to be a fool for Christ in suffering. Listen what it says. He says, we've been hungry and thirsty and poorly clothed. We've been roughly treated. We've even been homeless. We toil, working with our own hands. When we revile, we bless. When we're persecuted, we endure. When we're slandered, we try to conciliate. We have become as the scum of the world and the dregs of all things, even until now. Paul recorded so many other times in 1st and 2nd Corinthians about the times he'd been beaten and suffered for the gospel and for Christ. Girls, are you willing, even in the things that you're going through, those seasons of suffering where you suffer, to say, Lord, though I suffer, I will still glorify you. I will still serve you. And even though others may criticize me and say, well, I don't see her God coming through for her. I don't see her God answering her prayers. She's still suffering, isn't she? Are you willing to be a fool and say, though they slay me, yet will I serve and yet will I glorify you? Will you just continue on to glorify God even in your suffering and even when others criticize you? David was a fool in the way he wholeheartedly worshiped the Lord. But Paul was a fool in the way he wholeheartedly served the Lord and because of the way he suffered for the Lord. He was willing to serve the Lord even, and it did, bring him criticism from those he loved. Are you willing to be a fool for Christ? Girls, follow those two famous fools, David and Paul. Be the kind of Christian, the kind of woman who will worship, who will serve, and who will even suffer for Christ's sake, and even to the extent that you be called a fool for Christ's sake. That's the only kind of fool you want to be. Well, this is going to be the last session, as I said, of our series, You Might Be a Foolish Woman If. But next week here on the Front Porch, I've got an exciting announcement to make as we get ready to begin a new series on marriage. I will tell you all about it right here next week on Front Porch Friday. I'll see you then. Bye, girls.